Thank you. How many of you would say that in the last week or so, you remember being in a conversation with somebody in which you were remarking on the polarization that's been going on in this country? How many of you would say you were probably involved in that kind of, yeah. Everywhere I go, people hugely have that on their minds. So I'd like to address that, first of all, the political moment that we live in. Because any form of social change always exists in the context of what's going on around it, right? So as I've traveled around, I've heard a lot of people say, well, what scares me about this degree of polarization that we've got with all this shouting and no listening, it seems, and violence, so much violence going on, that it makes us stuck. It means that we can't move forward. And I also had that view for quite a while. But then in researching the Nordics' experience of turning themselves around, I got turned around with regard to my attitude. And so I now have a fairly peculiar attitude toward this polarization that's going on. So if you're willing to have a different attitude expressed here, that's what I would like to do. This is what led to my peculiar point of view. It was finding out that, well, first of all, just to recap, you probably are aware, thanks to Bernie Sanders and others, that the Nordic countries are at the top of the heap of all the nations in terms of degree of economic justice, of equality, well-being for people. It's the best place in the world to be a mom, best place to be an elder, best place to be somebody who wants to go to university because university is free, and best place if you aren't an academic kind of learner, because apprenticeships are widely available for people who learn best that way. Best place to be a toddler. I mean, you name it, they're right there at the top of the charts. The Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland. And so I, in studying them, was very curious because a century ago, they were a mess. Right? A century ago, Norwegians were coming here. And Swedes were coming here, right? I mean, there was this mass exodus. People were fleeing their countries, not because they got tired of their relatives, maybe some, but mostly because there was no opportunity in those countries. So how can it be that 100 years ago they were in such bad shape, and today they outpace the United States by yards? I mean, Norway even has more startups per capita than the United States does. And the United States is supposed to be entrepreneurs' paradise, right? It's not. The paradise for entrepreneurs is in the Nordic countries. So how can this be? How could they turn themselves around? I had to answer that question to write that book. So I went deep into their history. This is what I found out, that they made their turnaround at exactly the time when their societies were most polarized. At exactly the time when their societies were in most ferment, when the turbulence was greatest, when Nazis were marching openly in the streets of Oslo, Norway, for example. When, on the other extreme, there were people actively organizing for the dictatorship of the proletariat. I mean, you had a huge spectrum, a huge range of views, and they were really mixing it up. Major turbulence going on in those societies, and it was exactly at those times that their polarization was greatest in modern history that they made their change. How can that be? So in pondering that, I thought, well, I could look at my own country, because I like the history of my own country. 1930s, the most polarized time of the first half of the 20th century. What did we have? Massive polarization. Ku Klux Klan, which was growing like crazy in the 20s, really, showing its stuff in the 30s, right? Growth of the American Nazi Party in that period. And at the same time, people on the extreme left were also working very hard and organizing hard. Tremendous polarization. And the 30s, of course, was the time of the greatest move forward of our country in terms of justice issues and equality in the whole, in that half century of the first part of the 20th century. So, wow, what was going on in the Nordics when that went on here was also a big progress time. How can that be? So I fast forwarded to the 60s. Some of you know of the 60s anyway, and some of you lived in them. 60s and the 60s is called the 60s, but really goes into the 70s with the women's movement, LGBTQ, and the environmentalist movement really taking off in the 70s. So in that period, what do we have again? Tremendous polarization. Again, Ku Klux Klan riding high. Again, the Nazis. I'll tell you a story. There I was with my former wife, who's Norwegian, and we were standing next to each other in a very tight crowd because we were all in a street corner listening to James Baldwin talk about the Vietnam War. This was in Washington, D.C. It's a demonstration. We were all like pressed in together, trying to not have anybody hit by a car, and listening to Baldwin. And you know, our hips were pressed against each other. Suddenly, no pressure. I turn quickly and see she's headed for the concrete. I reach quickly and just prevent her head from cracking the concrete. And wait until she recovers. And I say, Barrett, what's up? This is not a woman who faints. What's up? She pointed. I looked where she was pointing. There was a group of young men with swastikas on their armbands, on their arms. And it was a trigger experience because she hadn't seen the swastika since occupied Norway, World War II, when she was a girl, and there were soldiers marching past her house. Yeah, we had that in the 60s. And we also had, in the 60s and 70s, the greatest leap forward that we had in the second half of the 20th century. So what is this about polarization keeping us stuck? It appears to be just the reverse. The polarization sets us loose to make tremendous progress. How about that? I needed a metaphor because it's taken me 5 minutes to describe this. We need a metaphor for describing what's going on in a society that enables people to do stuff that they couldn't do other times. And I found that metaphor in the house of a metal sculptor, an artist in Glasgow, Scotland, where I was staying. He was giving me hospitality. It was a book tour for Viking Economics. And he was very proud of his house. His house was full of these gorgeous metal objects that he had been an artist in other media, and then he decided he wanted to work in metal, and it was gorgeous stuff all over. I said, how do you do this? How do you do this with metal? And he said, here, I'll show you my workshop. He took me in the back and showed me this big forge and said, when I realized I wanted to try that out as an art form, I apprenticed with a blacksmith. And he showed me how to use the forge to make the metal soft enough that it could be bent and turned into art objects. It's the heat that does it. And I said, thank you. Now I've got my metaphor. What polarization did in the 20s and 30s for the Nordics and for us in the 30s and then the 60s, what it did was took the rigidity of the society and heated it up, made it volatile, made it possible to do stuff with that couldn't have been done in another decade. What was done in the 30s could not have been done in the 20s. What was done in the 60s I remember the 50s very well. We were called God's frozen people. No way you could accomplish major change in the 50s, but we were able to accomplish major change in the 60s because the forge was heating up the society. And so I, at age 81, am delighted still to be alive because the forge is working. And the society is heating up. And we have the opportunity a second time in my life, not just the 60s, which I was, of course, fully participating in, but I get a second round. I hope you all get a second round, you young people. But anyway, us older folks, we get a second round at this. And what an opportunity. So I'm very excited about that. That's the good news. But maybe you want to hear the bad news. Oh, you've already heard the bad news. The bad news is that the polarization is going to get worse. So just to warn you, because the polarization, political scientists tell us, is directly related to the degree of economic inequality in a society. And the tax bill just passed in December guarantees even more economic inequality. It's already at historic levels, but it's going to go beyond historic levels in terms of degree of inequality, and that means the amount of polarization we can expect will increase. That I try to incorporate in my book, How We Win. That expectation. That is, that what we need is ways of being able to stay strong and centered and clear and empowered, even while there's a massacre in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, even while yet another school mass attack, even while those things are going on, we need to know how to be able to navigate that situation in such a way to bring about the change that we so deserve and haven't ever gotten in this country anything like the promise that was implied in the American dream. So how to do that? Obviously, it's not easy. It's very easy to go into panic. It's very easy to go into isolation. It's very easy to be snarky, right? To be impatient with each other, to call each other out, to put each other down, to humiliate each other, to blame each other. It's very easy to go into all that stuff because that's all the negative reactivity to the negativity that comes out of the White House and out of many other sources. It's just, we could kind of copycat the worst impulses of those who are opposed to us. So instead of doing that, what we could do is figure out ways of supporting each other to experience more solidarity, to be able to become, of course, aware of the oppression dynamics that go on in each one of us, because we're all brought up in a society that teaches us systematically, socializes us systematically into oppressive behavior with each other, but figure out how to support each other actually to change instead of just doing the reactive stuff, which is the stuff that's coming from the top. And that's part of what's in the book, How We Win. A lot of the book has to do with using the particular instrumentality, the particular technology called campaigns. And one reason why that is so important, it's not by any means enough. We also need co-ops. We also need other forms of infrastructure that bind us together, that help us to stay strong and centered and grounded in the midst of a society where the forge is doing this thing to us, right? We need that. We also need campaigns because campaigns represent training in combat. And if we want the change that we want, we're going to have to expect to fight for it. Frederick Douglass told us that a long time ago. If you don't fight for the change you want, don't expect it to come about. And nothing that I've learned in studying polarization has suggested that polarization by itself delivers the goods to us. We can all just relax and polarization will deliver. No. It's not some kind of historic machinery that takes place. Think of Germany in the 20s and 30s. They also had polarization. They went to Hitler, right? Italy had massive polarization in the 20s and 30s. They went to Mussolini. So there's no guarantees about this forge. The forge actually doesn't care whether you're making metal or not. It doesn't care if you make gorgeous metal sculptures or if you do something really terrible. You can make swords. You can make broadswords with it. The forge doesn't care. The forge just creates the environment in which you can do what you want to do. So what we have to get is clarity about what it is we want in our society. And everybody I talk with, and this is also demonstrated in polls, majorities of Americans want very, very much more equality than we have. A majority of Americans actually want a functioning democracy. I know that seems like a far-fetched idea, but there it is. The pollsters, including Republicans, a majority of Republicans say the economic elite has too much influence on policymaking on a federal level. That's a majority of Republicans think that. I believe that a majority of Americans would definitely buy a vision of America that could be presented in a common sense way and that would offer the goodies that the Nordics offer as a matter now of course to their people. Every time I talked about Viking economics on my previous 1.5-year book tour, people would say, "Oh, I want to move there." And in fact, that's the direction of immigration, is to Norway and Sweden, not from there to here. Americans want that. My brother voted for Trump. He listens to Rush Limbaugh and all of that. When I come back from Norway, I get talking with him. We have a great relationship. And I say, your grandchildren, he has a couple of grandchildren who have disabilities that need a good deal of extra attention. And I say, what I learned was in Norway, the situation for your grandchildren would be responded to in this way, blah, blah, blah. And that's backed up by their healthcare system, which operates in this way, blah, blah, blah. And he's listening with all ears. He cares hugely about his grandchildren. And he says, sounds like a plan. I don't use the word socialism. I just tell him how it works. And of course, like most Americans, he wants something that works. And most Trump voters want something, most Trump working class voters, I should modify that, want something that works. And they know they're not going to get it. They knew that they weren't going to get it from Hillary Clinton. And so they voted for Trump. That was the condition of my brother. He said, I know if I vote for Hillary Clinton, it's more of the same, which is the abandonment of my people. I come from a blue-collar family, and my brother is a very proud blue-collar guy. He says, I know the Democrats walked out on the working class long ago, and they've totally abandoned my people, and I can't, in good conscience, vote for somebody who's a continuation of the abandonment of my people. I can't do that. I can't bring myself to do it. So I'm going to vote for Trump. Nobody knows what Trump's politics are. And there's something to be said. He doesn't himself know what his own politics are. So he said there's a random chance that he might do something right for my people, whereas I know that she won't. Of course, I don't expect that you would necessarily agree with his decision to vote. I didn't. But it represents tremendous hope. But in order to get into that kind of dialogue, I think we're going to need to build campaigns that go for common sense goals where the economic elite, which wants to veto so many of the things that we want, will be caught in the act of resisting things that people need. So, for example, the campaign that I'm involved with right now is called Power Local Green Jobs. It's in the Philadelphia area. Philadelphia is the largest, it has the largest amount of poverty of any large city in the United States. It's a scandal. It's an outrage. Here's this utility, electrical utility. I understand Boulder has a history of a difficult, obstreperous kind of electrical utility, right? Our electrical utility sends $1 million profit a day from our area to the parent company in Chicago. $1 million a day, goodbye. While it sits astride a situation of massive poverty, including poverty that is experienced by black people and Latinos as well. So there we go. A scandal and a shame, right? People would love for that situation not to exist. So we say, why doesn't the utility solarize those neighborhoods, get the electricity off the roofs, increase resilience, so on and so on. Probably a lot of you know very well the arguments for doing that. Very commonsensical to Philadelphians. When we present that demand to other people, they say, yeah, that's a good idea. Wow, what's their response? And then we say, oh, well, they'd rather send that $1 million a day to their parent company than invest in the place where they earn the money. Oh, that's interesting. That's what we need. We need campaigns that force the issue in ways that common sense folks can see whose side they're on. And that's the reason I wrote the book. Look back to 100 years ago, women's suffrage movement, all the way up to now, and extract from the successful movements the things that they did right that we might be able to use in our situation today. A campaign, a direct action campaign, is something where, as you can tell from the one I just described, you've got a demand that you want. Can take some tinkering to figure out exactly what that demand is, but it's a demand that you want and that you think is, in principle, winnable. No guarantees you'll win, but you might, right? Looks good, looks promising. And you've got an opponent, or a target is also a name used, who can give you that demand. That's what a campaign is, a direct action campaign. And then what you do to get that opponent to do what you say it should do is that you make trouble for that opponent and you go after their vulnerabilities. So it's good to have an analysis of what their vulnerabilities are before you start the campaign. So fast forward to the what makes this what is very often local campaigns, right, about this or that pipeline or fracking or whatever it is that people are spotlighting, whatever people are working on specifically. An immigrant rights question, a question of unaccountable police shooting unarmed black people, whatever the issue is figuring out the kind of campaign that would make a difference. And then, because many of those campaigns are local in character, creating from that process a movement, because movements naturally grow from when there are multiple campaigns on a similar issue, like the sit-in movement, right? And then the next step, and a harder step, is to get a movement around X, let's say environmental, and a movement around something else, let's say racism, and movement around something else, and get those movements working together in such a way, I put a question mark because it's hard, in such a way as to get a movement of movements. Why do you want a movement of movements? Because the vetoing power in our system is the same for all the progressive issues. You want gun rights, you want gun control, you're going to run into the same opponent as those who want unaccountable police, as those who want, or who want the measures that result in climate change, and so on and so on, right? It's the same bunch. It's the economic elite. And so the movements have an interest in going after the same opponent by combining and working together. They not only have an interest, they have the necessity of getting it. Because what we've seen for the last 30, 40 years is movements trying to go it alone and failing, and even losing gains that previously were met, right? Losing, say, on voting rights that previously were gotten. People lost their lives for voting rights in the civil rights movement. I was part of that. And then I have been losing them lately. So a good way to lose is to keep your movement separate from other movements. I run into environmentalists who do that all the time. Oh, but climate change, George, is the most important thing, so we can't even mention anything else. I say, oh, well, if losing is okay with you, that's all right. But I think differently. I want to win. Putting movements together gives us the chance to actually win. Because what the Nordics did was they put their movements together. They had a lot of competition, a lot of oppressive stuff going on by industrial workers looking down their noses on farmers and stuff like, in those societies. And what they did, though, was put the movements together in order to push out the economic elite from its historic dominant role. For centuries, the economic elite had been running those societies. They were pushed out. They were fired. We're just not going to let you do that anymore. They had a contestation of power, and the economic elite lost. Sure, the economic elite called out the troops to defend their privilege. Of course. what would you expect a self-respecting economic elite to do? They have the power of the state at their hands, so of course they they use the police and the army to defend their position, and they lost. Because the movements represented the majority of people, and the majority of people can win against the small elite, even with the backing of state power. You may want to push back on that, and I would welcome that. Anyway, the point of the narrative of this book then is that if people understand, if the movements understand that working together, they're far more likely to get what they want than trying to work separately, and join together, then they can unplug the plugged up system and make the change that we need. There's an additional thing, though, that I should mention in addition to the building of the infrastructure along the way, and that is it's enormously helpful to have a vision of what we want. Because having a vision to present wins over many people who are disturbed by the disruptive character of your campaigns. Direct action is disruptive. It must be in order to coerce the economic elite. Economic elites don't get coerced by dialogue, and they don't get coerced by lobbying, and they don't get coerced by court action. They only get coerced by direct action. It's combat that actually does it. But that is disruptive. And so, but especially middle-class people get very concerned about disruption. They start, that candidate X talks about law and order. Maybe we like some law and order here because this is getting very chaotic here. And these people, it's Dr. King, he keeps talking about compassion and nonviolence, but actually he's disrupting everything in my city. And they gave him the Nobel Peace Prize. And why? Because our city was nice and orderly before he came. And all that goes on, right? So in order to deal with that, it's enormously helpful to have a vision that reassures people this is what we're going for and there's room for you. That we go through this disruption because we have to in order to get it. But when we get it, there's a spot for you. Now, the economic elite will not have a spot for them that's anything like the spot they've got now. The 1% will be represented by, say, 1% of the influence instead of 60 or 70% of the influence in that society, all right? But nevertheless, for most people, and that's what we need a majority, and in this society, we definitely need middle-class participation as well as working class and participation, and poor people's participation, reassuring people that there's a common sense vision that is going to make society better for almost everybody, say 70 or 80% of the population, is reassuring. And that's why just a few weeks ago in Vermont, there was a Vermont Vision Summit. People who had been studying Viking economics and said, let's get together and start building a vision for our state. And if we're successful at that, let's then extend it to a vision for New England. And if we're successful at that, and so on and so on. Our vision muscles are kind of, limp right now because this political culture in this country has become vision averse since the 70s. There's been a real falling away of the visionary impulse. But let's get it back. Let's rebuild it so that we can actually bring vision to the table. Okay, so that may be enough. I've tried to speak in a way that would be reasonably provocative, hoping that this would be a kind of crowd that would want to push back, ask really hard questions. But in case you're prone to attacks of politeness, I'd like to encourage you to turn to each other for a couple of minutes. In threes, fours, you can turn around and engage people behind you and see if in small huddles of 3, 4, 5 people, you can come up with questions that will really press me hard. That will really, maybe you will ask the question that finally shows George Lakey he doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, so let's give that a try. Please, wherever you are, turn around and find the holes in the argument, find the problems, find the things that George needs to respond to. Enjoy.